I'm Briar Holt, and I was 33 the day my mother stood on my own dock with a realtor and a leather folder and told 40 years of family friends that she was selling my home out from under me as a kindness. She didn't know the deed already had my name on it. She'd find that out in about 4 minutes, in front of everyone she'd ever wanted to impress. But before I tell you about that Saturday, I need you to understand the night that made it happen. 9 years earlier, at my own father's retirement party, my mother stood up in a room of 40 people, raised a glass of Prosecco, and thanked my younger brother for finally making something of himself. I was standing 15 feet away. I'd closed a deal 3 weeks earlier worth more than his entire salary. Nobody in that room knew. Nobody asked. That night is where this really starts. Welcome back to Calm Drama Stories, where the quiet ones stop explaining themselves and start showing receipts. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, and subscribe so the next one finds you too. Because this one ends with my mother's own hand shaking too badly to hold a glass of wine, and I promise you, she earns every second of it. I was the practical one. That's the whole shape of my childhood in 4 words. My brother Holt was the easy one, the charming one, the one whose failures got turned into tenderness in the car on the drive home. I learned the math early. If I succeeded, I got a nod and a question about whether I'd fed the dog. If Holt failed, he got 20 minutes of my mother telling him his swing looked beautiful even when he struck out. I was 12 the first time I understood exactly where I stood. I won a regional science fair. My mother sat through the ceremony, clapped on cue, and on the drive home asked if I'd remembered to feed the dog because Holt had a game in 40 minutes. He struck out twice and dropped a fly ball. She spent the whole ride home telling him how proud she was of his effort. I didn't cry about it that day. I want to be honest with you. I cried about it plenty of other nights, alone, in a way nobody in that house ever saw. I learned to do my crying in private and my calm in public, because the one time I let my hurt show at the dinner table, my mother sighed and said, "Don't be so sensitive, Briar, it's not always going to be about you." I was 12. I never made that mistake again. I didn't know yet that the same coldness that taught me to hide my feelings would, 20 years later, be the exact thing that made her underestimate me completely. My great-uncle Gus ran a small marina on the bay, and my family treated it the way you'd treat an old man's odd little hobby. My mother called it Gus's little operation, so often it stopped sounding like a description and started sounding like a verdict. I started spending summers there at 14, mostly to get away from a house where every conversation eventually circled back to Holt's grades, Holt's friends, Holt's feelings. Gus handed me a wrench on my first morning and told me the boat doesn't care how I feel about a mistake. It just needs me to find it and fix it. I want you to hold on to that sentence, because it's going to matter later in a way neither of us could have guessed. I loved him before I understood why. He was the only adult in my life who asked me questions and then actually waited for the answer. My mother's response to all this was confusion, dressed up as concern. "Why would you rather be covered in grease?" she asked me once, genuinely puzzled, "than do something normal, like Holt's friends?" I didn't have an answer that wouldn't have hurt her feelings, so I just said I liked it. What I meant was, it's the only place where nobody is comparing me to someone else. I worked there through college, paid my own way through a mechanical engineering degree, and by 26 I was running the whole repair side of Gus's operation. My family came to my graduation. I'll give them that. But the dinner afterward turned into a 20-minute conversation about Holt's new marketing job before anyone asked me a single follow-up question about my degree. I told myself it didn't matter. It would take one more year and one toast at a retirement party before I finally believed myself. I was 28 at my father's retirement party. 3 weeks earlier, Gus and I had quietly closed the largest contract in the Marina's history. I hadn't told anyone in my family because some tired part of me had stopped expecting it to land the way it should. My mother stood up that night and toasted Holt for finally making something of himself. The room applauded. I stood near the coat rack with a glass of seltzer and felt something in my chest go very still, the way water goes still right before it freezes. A cousin asked if I was still doing the boat thing. I said yes. The conversation moved on. I drove home and sat in my own driveway for 20 minutes before I could make myself go inside. I want to tell you I felt rage. What I actually felt was smaller and sadder than that, the specific loneliness of doing something real and watching it disappear the moment it entered a room with your family in it. I cried in that car. I'm not going to pretend the calm came easy. It came because I had nowhere else to put the hurt, and crying in a driveway alone at 28 years old, after closing the biggest deal of your career, is its own particular kind of grief. What I didn't know that night was that my mother had already started, quietly and without ever saying it out loud, planning exactly how she'd divide up something she'd never once asked a real question about. Gus's health started slipping a year after that party. I covered more of the marina as he slowed down, and one cold evening, with his space heater humming in the corner of his office, he told me he'd been thinking about what happens to the place when he's gone. "Your mother thinks this is a hobby," he said. "She has no idea what it generates, because she's never once thought it was worth asking." He looked at me for a long time. "You've never asked me for anything in 14 years except harder problems." That's the rarest thing I've ever seen in a person. I want to tell you, I felt triumphant hearing that. I didn't. I felt like crying again because it was the first time in my entire life an adult had described me like I was worth paying attention to, and some old, 12-year-old part of me almost didn't know what to do with it. A few months later, he called his attorney, Walter Pruitt, and quietly transferred the entire marina, land, business, everything into my name. Recorded at the county courthouse. Done, permanently, while he was still alive to make sure no one could contest it later. I didn't tell my family. Part of it was privacy. But I'll be honest with you about the other part. Some quiet, wounded piece of me wanted to see, with total clarity, exactly how they'd talk about Gus's little operation, while believing it was still his to eventually carve up among themselves. I got my answer faster and uglier than I expected, and it came less than a week after we buried him. Gus died peacefully in his sleep, 3.5 years after that conversation, at 84, having worked a half day at the marina less than a week before. I want to tell you honestly, grieving him broke something open in me that my entire family had never managed to touch. He was the first person who believed in me without making me audition for it first. At the funeral reception, in the same office where he and I once talked through a space heater's hum, my mother pulled me aside. "We should talk soon about the marina," she said, her voice already shifting into the register I'd grown up dreading. "Now that Gus is gone, it'll need to be appraised and divided properly among the family." I asked her what she meant by the family. "Well, Briar," she said, with the gentle condescension she saved for explaining obvious things to people she decided were slow, "Gus didn't have children. It comes back to your father, and by extension you and Holt. We'll get it appraised, figure out a fair split, and sell it, since none of us actually know how to run a marina." I excused myself to go check on the catering, because I needed somewhere to put my hands before I said something I'd regret at my great-uncle's own funeral. I didn't correct her that day. I let her keep planning. And 6 weeks later, she'd bring a realtor to my own dock to finish the job. If you've ever watched your family confidently plan around something they assumed was theirs without once asking the person it actually belonged to, drop a comment and tell me. I think you'd be surprised how many of us have lived some version of exactly this. If this is sitting somewhere tender right now, hit subscribe. It gets harder before it gets good, and I promise you the ending is worth staying for. I called Walter the next morning, mostly because some part of me still needed to hear the official confirmation out loud, even though I already knew it. "The transfer was completed 4 years ago," he told me. "There's nothing left in Gus's estate to divide. The marina is yours. Your family has no legal claim to any of it." "They don't know that," I said. "No," he agreed. "From what you've told me, they don't." I sat with that fact for days, turning over the same old, exhausting question. Do I tell her quietly, privately, and spare everyone a scene? I drafted a text to my mother one night and stared at it for 20 minutes before deleting it. What stopped me wasn't spite. It was 9 years of watching exactly how she handled facts that didn't fit her plans. She never argued with them directly. She just softened them in private until they became a version everyone else eventually repeated as truth. If I told her quietly in a kitchen, I had no doubt that within a month, the story would become some gentle variation of Briar convinced poor confused Gus to leave her everything, and isn't that a shame for Holt? I'd watched her do exactly that on smaller stages my entire life. So I let her keep building her plan in full view of everyone, and 3 weeks later, she handed me, without knowing it, the exact room I needed to finally end it. Within 3 weeks, my mother had hired a realtor named Janet Ross and gotten a preliminary valuation based on nothing but comparable properties and a drive-by look, without ever asking to see the actual books. My brother called me one evening, his voice carrying the awkward warmth of someone delivering news he half suspected wouldn't land well. "Mom's thinking the Marina's worth $2.5 million," he said. "She wants to split it 3 ways. Is it currently profitable, do you know?" I asked him. "Mom always talked about it like it basically broke even," he admitted. "Gus's little hobby that happened to pay its own bills." I hung up and sat with that for a long time. Not anger exactly. Something closer to grief for how little, after everything, my family had ever actually understood about the thing they were now confidently dividing up over dinner. And I had no idea, hanging up that phone, that this conversation alone would become the first crack in my brother, the first small thing that would, weeks later, make him the only one of them brave enough to look me in the eye. The invitation came soon after. My mother suggested we all sail out together to talk things through as a family, with the realtor joining, just to give us a sense of the property. Nothing official, honey, just information. I said yes immediately, and I meant a different yes than she heard. I spent the next 6 weeks building a room the truth could finally stand up in. I asked Walter to be present that Saturday, quietly, holding the one document that would end the conversation the second it needed ending. I asked my office manager to make sure the real financial records were simply available, not waved around, just sitting there the way truth does its best work, quietly in the open, waiting to be looked at. I thought, more than once, about ending the suspense early. Each time, I thought about that toast at the retirement party, about 14 years of being called practical instead of valued, and I decided to let her finish building her plan in front of every witness who mattered, so nobody could quietly edit the story afterward. She had no idea, climbing onto that boat on a clear Saturday morning, that she was sailing toward the one conversation in her life she would never get to control the ending of. The cabin cruiser came around the point a little before 11. My mother stood on the bow in a crisp white outfit entirely unsuited for an actual boat, the kind of outfit you wear when you're dressing for a transaction. Holt stood beside her, quiet. My father sat near the stern, careful as always never to be at the center of anything. She walked up my dock, surveying it the way she'd survey anything she'd already decided to sell, and when she reached me, she smiled and said, "This all looks wonderful, Briar. You really have kept it up nicely." Kept it up. As though I'd been watering someone else's houseplant for 14 years. I felt that sentence land somewhere old and tender in me, the same place that 12-year-old still lived, the one who'd been asked about the dog instead of the science fair. We sat at the picnic table where Gus and I had eaten 1,000 lunches. My mother opened with warmth that had a clear plan buried just beneath it. "A third to us, a third to Holt, a third to you, Briar, since you put in so much work. We think that's generous, given you didn't actually own any of it." Janet Ross opened her portfolio. $2.5 million, she said, based on comparable acreage. I let them finish completely. I let every word of that plan sit out in the open air, because I knew exactly what was about to happen to it. "Actually, Mom," I said quietly, "the Marina isn't part of any estate to divide. There's nothing here for any of us to sell. Gus transferred full ownership to me 4 years ago." The table went still. A gull cried somewhere over the fuel dock. My mother laughed, the small social laugh she used whenever a fact threatened to inconvenience her. "Honey, that's not how this works. He was a sweet old man who let you help out, that's all." Walter stepped forward and opened his folio. "Mrs. Holt, I handled Gus's affairs for over 20 years. He held up a single page with a county recording stamp. "This is the recorded deed. Briar Holt has held full legal ownership for 4 years. There's nothing remaining in Gus's estate. Nothing to appraise. Nothing to divide." I watched my mother's face do something I had never seen it do in 33 years. The warmth cracked off it all at once, and underneath was something raw and, for 1 second, genuinely frightened. "That's not possible," she said, her hand shaking so badly the wine glass beside her tipped and bled across the white tablecloth Janet had set her portfolio on. He would have told me. He was family. He told the person he trusted with the actual work, Walter said, mild and unhurried. And that was the sentence that finally, after 33 years, broke something open in my father that I never expected to see. You manipulated him, my mother said, sharper now, turning fully on me. He was old, he was lonely. I felt the old flinch start in my chest, the lifelong reflex to apologize, to shrink, to make the discomfort stop. For one terrifying second, I almost did it, and then, for the first time in my entire life, I let it pass through me instead of taking hold. I never asked him for anything in 14 years except harder problems, I said. You called this place his little operation for 30 years. You never once asked what it took to run, or what it would mean to the one person who showed up here every single day. You're not angry I took something from you, Mom. You're angry you never noticed there was something here worth paying attention to until somebody else already had. Holt spoke up then, quieter than I'd ever heard him. Mom, I didn't even know this place made real money until 20 minutes ago. Maybe we should just hear her out. My father stood, walked over, and said, in a voice I'd rarely heard him use in 33 years, I should have asked you more questions, Briar. About all of it. I'm sorry. It wasn't a grand reckoning. He went back to my mother's side a moment later, the way he always did. But he'd said the true thing out loud, in front of witnesses, and I'm not going to pretend that didn't matter to me more than I expected it to. I had waited my entire childhood for one of them to choose me over the comfortable version of the story. I got it for exactly one sentence. It was enough to start something. It wasn't enough to undo 33 years. The visit ended within the hour. My mother, finding no traction anywhere, fell into a brittle silence I'd never seen from her before. Before boarding the boat, she turned to me one last time, her voice stripped of all its earlier certainty. We're still your family, Briar, whatever the paperwork says. I thought about 14 years of being called practical instead of capable, about a science fair, and a question about the dog, about a toast that skipped right over me. Family is supposed to notice you, I said. You're welcome to keep calling yourselves that. I'm just not going to keep waiting for it to be true. I didn't slam any gates. I just turned and walked back up my own dock, toward the ordinary, steady work that had built this entire life out from under everyone's notice. In the years since, my mother has called twice, once to ask, carefully, about helping Holt through a rough patch, which I declined gently and on my own terms. The second time, around the holidays, she asked how the season had gone, and after a long pause said, almost shyly, your great-uncle always did know things about people before the rest of us caught up. I don't know yet what we'll rebuild, if anything. But Holt came out last spring with no agenda at all, just genuine questions, the kind of curiosity I'd waited my whole childhood to see pointed at anything I did. We're building something slower and more honest than what we grew up with. Most mornings now, before the staff arrives, I walk down to the fuel dock alone, the way Gus used to, and stand there a few minutes before the day's problems start needing me. Here's what I know now that I didn't understand at 28, standing near a coat rack with a glass of seltzer water. Being unnoticed by people who already decided what you deserve isn't the same as being unworthy. It just means you've been handed, unfairly, the job of proving something that never should have needed proving. You don't have to keep proving it forever. At some point, quietly, on your own schedule, you get to stop waiting for the room to notice and build something so solid that the room finally has no choice. That's my story. 14 years of being called practical, one deed recorded years before anyone knew to ask, and a dock that finally got to be mine in front of every person who doubted it. If someone in your life keeps mistaking your steadiness for something they're entitled to overlook, let this be your sign. Share this with whoever needs to hear it. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.